Hello. I wanted to spend a little bit of time working with you or visiting with you about the slides related to content area learning and vocabulary instruction. We only had time in class to do a few activities, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time making sure that you had a grasp of the content included in that chapter and thinking about how it relates to the other things that we've been studying this semester. Rupley, Logan, and Nichols describe vocabulary as the glue that holds stories, ideas, and content together. And I think that it's clear that if you don't have access to the vocabulary, it's going to be very difficult for you to comprehend the material and really to understand the nuances of what's being discussed or worked with in the classroom. Really important to remember that many times teachers do not attend to vocabulary instruction as systematically as is necessary, particularly for children who have limited vocabulary. So let's talk a little bit about that. In class, we read along these words. I don't know if you remember, we read them in isolation, and then I asked everyone, do you know what all these words mean? And everybody said, yes, we do. And then we read this passage, and once those words are in a context, in a very specific, cognitively demanding context, many of you said, I have no idea what that passage is about, even though I understand the words when they're presented in isolation. And so the point of that is to really think about that it's not just, am I familiar with a word, but am I familiar with how that word might be used in an academic context, and can I make sense of it when it is presented in that context? So I think that's very important to remember about yourself and also about the children that you teach. So remember that when students don't understand the vocabulary, they can't fully understand the text. And so good vocabulary instruction looks at a number of kinds of words. The words that students see frequently, important words, key words that help them understand the text. So for instance, in the passage that we read previously, the word table has a very specific meaning in this context that's very different perhaps than the way the children understand the term table in everyday communication. And then they also need words, assistance with difficult words, idiomatic words, or words that have more than one meaning, and being able to really think about that and understand those nuances. Okay. I think this is some interesting information. It was actually collected by Isabel Beck back in 2004. She has a new revised version of this text, and I'm sure she's looked at it again. But a lot of this research is seminal, and what it tells us is that there is a wide range of vocabulary knowledge among students that you're likely to teach in schools. And so if you look, back in the 40s, Smith had said high knowledge third graders have vocabularies equal to the lowest performing 12th graders. So think about that for a minute. So for a child who is in 12th grade, a senior in high school, but performing below expectations, their vocabulary might be equal to that of a child in third grade with a lot of strong vocabulary knowledge and skills. So think about what that really implies for being able to comprehend material in the classroom. Linguistically poor first graders are said to know 5,000 words. Linguistically rich first graders know 20,000. It's a big difference. Once established, those differences in vocabulary learning and understanding and use are very difficult to ameliorate. And so that speaks to the fact that we need to be paying a lot of attention to vocabulary instruction in schools and doing it well, although much of the research would say that we have not. Sharon Vaughn, who's one of the authors of your textbook, presented research just a few years ago at a conference that basically said if teachers are going to not pay enough attention to one of the 5 pillars of reading instruction, the one they're most likely to miss out on is vocabulary instruction. So while some of this research is, like I said, seminal, older research, we know that that phenomenon continues today. And so as I said, knowing a word is not an all or nothing proposition, because it may be that I don't have any knowledge about it. It may be that I can kind of figure it out in context, or it may be that I really have a very rich and flexible understanding of that word. I can use it in a variety of contexts. I can think of a number of ways to explain what that word means. I have a depth of understanding about it. So it's true that high vocabulary people not only know more words, but they know more about those words. And they have a deeper, richer understanding of their use both in terms of conversational context and academic context. So some things I want you to remember is that you can support students by selecting essential words. And remember, we've been talking a lot in your reading instruction that you have to limit the number of words you introduce at one time because children can only learn so many at one time. So I want you to be thinking about the fact that you have to think about those word choices carefully and choose words that are going to have a lot of power. You have to explicitly define and contextualize those words in ways that children understand. And then you have to give them lots of opportunities to use those words and process that information. And they say that it takes using a word multiple times in order to make it our own. So it's not just sort of a one-shot, this is what this word means, and now we assume the child has it as part of their vocabulary and we can move on with other instruction. Remember that instruction isn't effective when we treat all the words that we select the same way. So some words need different kinds of teaching strategies or should be taught with different strategies than others. When we only provide a definition and a sentence or an example, and how many of you was your experience that new vocabulary was taught because the teacher said, here are the list of new words, let's use them in a sentence. It's pretty common. And we need to make our examples more interesting. So look at the following. A quarrel. If you look that up in the dictionary, you may see something like an argument, a disagreement. The teacher told the boys to stop quarreling. Well, that's not all that exciting, right? But if you think about a context in which two children might be inclined to quarrel and you provide that for the students and then you use that word and you use it multiple times, that might be something that they would be able to access. So I mentioned dictionary definitions. My father's favorite thing to say when I was growing up, if you didn't know the meaning of the word, was go get the dictionary. And I know that very few people anymore use a bound volume, a text dictionary. Many people use dictionaries online. And so space restrictions are not as extreme, but in classrooms, most children don't have access all day to computers. They are taught to use dictionaries. And because of the space restrictions, sometimes the definitions are actually very difficult to understand. And it makes the word really hard to understand if you don't have a context for it. I also want you to remember that for your children who have difficulty with literacy skills, just sending them to the dictionary for a word may be really hard for them. They may not have the alphabetization skills to be able to find that word, the literacy skills to be able to decode and manage the definitions that are provided. And so you see sometimes a lot of convolutions in those dictionary definitions. So let's think about those kinds of definitions and how they work, okay? 60 and how effective they are, okay? So students were given dictionary definitions and asked to create sentences or answer questions about those words. And what they found was that 63% of the students' sentences were judged to be very odd, and 60% were unacceptable. And students frequently interpret one or two words from a definition as the entire meaning. So again, dictionaries alone are not going to be enough. We need to expand beyond that, and we need to think about, again, how to contextualize those words for students. I think I gave you the example the other day in class when we were talking about spelling of students being asked to write a story with all their spelling words. And if you really look at the quality of those stories, they tend to be pretty horrific. What's better instruction? Well, Beck says it's rich instruction and we choose interesting words that have mileage, that explanations are given in everyday connected language rather than dictionary definitions, that we can talk about several contexts in which a word could be used, that students do things that require them to process deeply the meaning of words. I'm getting ready to show you some of Isabel Beck's examples in a minute. That at least some of the examples and situations and questions are interesting and less pedantic, meaning just repetitive and boring regurgitation, and that students have a high frequency of encounters. If we really want them to learn new vocabulary, we have them use those words multiple times in multiple contexts. So let's look at some dictionary definitions and some student-friendly definitions and think about those. So contagious, able to be spread by contact. There's your dictionary definition. But a friendlier definition is an illness is contagious if you can catch it easily from another person who is sick with it. And then you can give children an example. A cold is contagious. That's why we talk to you in school about making sure that you practice good hygiene, because if you're exposed to someone else's germs, you can catch that illness, and therefore that illness is contagious. You can get it from someone else. Attention, thoughtful care or kindness. Kind of an interesting non-active explanation, right? But if someone is getting attention, they are being well taken care of. That's something children and students are far more likely to be able to understand. Here's one of my favorites. Unexpected, not expected. Well, they defined un for you, now meaning that it's not. They've given us some hints to the prefix, but not really to any other part of the word. They do then throw in surprising. If something is unexpected, you are surprised by it, and then you can give children examples of, it was very unexpected when the fire alarm went off or whatever, something that they can relate to. Eavesdropping, listening secretly to a conversation. How about this definition? If you're eavesdropping, you are listening to what other people are saying without them knowing. And, most children could relate to that in some context. You have to forgive me, I have a cold, so I may have to cough, and I may have to take a few sips of water as we're going through this. And so if you look, what Isabel Beck has done here is given some beginnings of sentences and some endings of sentences that children have to match. But if you notice, these sentences are complex and they very much define the term. So if you want someone to eavesdrop on a person in the next room, right, you can hear better if you put your ear up to the keyhole. So it really illustrates what that term eavesdrop would mean. The doorbell wasn't audible from the kitchen, so we didn't know the guests had arrived. You can again make a stronger connection to what that vocabulary word really means. Here are some sentence stems. Rather than just asking students to write a sentence with a word, how about asking them to do something that requires them to really explain the meaning of that term? Okay, the newspaper called Mr. Bowman a philanthropist because. Well, in order to finish that sentence stems, I really have to be able to describe what a philanthropist is. Or I told my teacher I wanted to be a spectator at the play because. Well, to justify again that I wanted to be a spectator, I have to know what a spectator is, right? So again, one of the things that she would say is give children something to do beyond just write a sentence with a word, which they might be able to do without actually understanding it. Okay, here are some other examples of some sort of fun activities. How surprised would you be if you saw your friend vault over the moon? Or the mayor urged everyone to leave town? Or a rabbit trudged through the garden? So you can see that again is one of those ways where it really makes you process at a little bit deeper level what those words mean. Those are the things that Isabel Beck is talking about. Here's another example where you're determining which takes most and least energy. To meander, to vault, to banter, to berate at the top of your voice, to stalk, to be a spectator. And so again, it's really making you think about in a deeper, more contextualized way what those words mean. Okay. And again, we can't point out, and you can't attend too much to, or there's no way to pay more attention to context than is necessary. We always need to be thinking about what is the context in which that term's used. And so I don't know if any of you remember reading The Telltale Heart, Edgar Allan Poe. You might have been exposed to it in high school. But look at the word acute. The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all the things in the heaven and the earth. So again, if we think about that context and we think about acute, it means that that sense was very sharp. It was working very well. I could hear everything. Again, painting a picture around the use of that word. Okay. here are some explanations, some friendly explanations of some of those terms that were used here in the Telltale Heart. I'll let you take a look at those yourself. But again, thinking about that we're taking time to really explain with some attention to detail what that word means within that context that the author is creating. Discussion starters for words. The narrator tells us that he is not mad, that the disease has sharpened his senses. In particular, the sense of hearing was acute. And then you ask students, what happened in the story to support that point of view? So they have to go back and they have to reread that piece, and they really do have to process what acute means in that context. And you can follow through with these other examples. Could an acute sense cause derision? If a child can answer that, or a student can answer that, they have to have a fairly good understanding of that word. Would you feel vexed if you saw your mother moving stealthily around your room? Think about that. And that's a pretty compelling thing for most adolescents to think about, right? Okay, and then, like I said, Isabel Beck is sort of the guru. She gives many, many examples of ways in which you can ask students to process these words, okay? So one of the things that when you're teaching concepts, I want you to think about the related conceptual vocabulary that you need to teach. And then I want you to think about the materials and how friendly they are in terms of giving children access to that vocabulary. Assess the students on their background knowledge, and then go through and use some sort of pre-learning or pre-reading activities to support that learning, okay? Conduct that activity, and then provide some post-learning activities to further reinforce and extend those concepts. These are really the skills for good teaching, but it's asking you to think very strategically about the vocabulary that you're going to expect students to use, okay? Some things to think about as you consider the specific word choices. And remember, you cannot introduce 10 or 15 words at one time, right? So you think about uncommon words, words that do not typically occur in the student's vocabulary. They may be important in a particular unit or lesson. So think about the word like abolitionist. And you're going to watch a video in a few minutes of Beck using some words like that have very specific contextual meanings, or I'm sorry, the video is actually Anita Archer, and thinking about how those are introduced, or emancipation. If I'm reading about the Civil War in my social studies classes, it's real important that I know the meaning of those words, even though they're not things that I'm likely to see or hear or necessarily be using on a daily basis. Words with multiple meanings, again, words that we may use every day, but they may have a very different meaning when used in an academic context, and you can see the examples there.